I'm so excited you all are here to hear about his new book, From Strength to Strength. It is number 6 as of last night on the Amazon of all books, which is huge considering Amazon has like 100,000 books. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Lisa Wagner, and I have the privilege and pleasure of working with AEI and with Arthur. I've worked with AEI for almost a decade now. AEI is a think tank dedicated to free enterprise, individual liberty, strong national defense. Many of you on this call today are supporters of AEI. Many of you know Arthur. For those of you who don't know Arthur but have heard him speak, welcome. For those of you who have supported AEI for a long time in a large or small way, thank you. And for those of you who are just curious to hear what this book is all about, we welcome you and hope you enjoy it and hope you all and hope you get more engaged. Whatever brought you here today, thank you, thank you, thank you. Arthur is one of my favorite people on the planet, and I can't think of a better person to end the work week with. I can't think of a better author. And since many of you know him, I'm not going to read his introduction or read his bio. What I thought I would do is do something a little bit differently and just say thank you to Arthur. Arthur, you have had a profound impact on my life. And I suspect many people's lives through your work and through your character. When I think back to the first time I was introduced to you, it was because someone gave me one of your books, The Battle, which, and this is before I knew about AEI, before I knew about you, and it literally changed my life because it reminded me about politics that it's about fighting for people and the policies that we fight for, not about the fight. And that had a profound impact on my thinking and some of the choices that I made. You also have demonstrated that there are many, 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 many paths to success, as your own life has shown. And as a parent who has some kids who are going to take the road less traveled in that regard, I really appreciate the thought and the conversations we've had. And finally, I just want to thank you for being my friend. We are, the world is a better place because of you. Thank you for kicking off our Coffee and Conversation series for AEI. We have a great crowd, as you can see, coming in. And so with that, I'm gonna turn it over to you and take it away, Arthur.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for your friendship, and thank you for all the good that you've done in the community in Chicago. I mean, you opened up the hearts of people in Chicago to the message of the American Enterprise Institute over the past 10 years like nobody ever has, and I don't think anybody ever could, because people trust you, they trust your values, and they trust the fact that you're not trying to raise money for political causes. You're trying to connect people with their deepest values, and you've done that for me as well. And thanks to all of you, old friends and new in Chicago. Thank you for being part of the American Enterprise Institute community. I'm not the president, I'm the president emeritus, and which feels a little funny at age 57 to be an emeritus something, but there you go. I was president for 10 years, from the end of 2008 until the middle of 2019. So nearly 11 years, as a matter of fact. And after I left, I turned the reins over to a friend of many of yours, Robert Dorr, who's done a spectacular job in growing and cultivating the institution, taking it from height to height. The whole principle of the American Enterprise Institute, as many of you know, is that there's a radical equality of human dignity, that there's greatness inside every person. And our job is to unlock it, to lift people up, to bring them together around the principles of what's great about this country, to celebrate the things that we have in common. And if I look around, this room here, I mean, we could tell 100 different family stories, but the one thing that we all have in common, the American thing that we all have in common, is that we descend from ambitious riffraff, and we're actually proud of that. Maintaining that spirit in a way that can actually create inspiration for people all around the world who are trying to be free, who are trying to live in democracy, who want to live in prosperity, who are really Americans in their hearts. That's the principle of the American Enterprise Institute. I know many of you are investing in, and thank you for doing so. I left AEI in 2019 and thinking and praying about what my next steps should be. I realized that the principles of human dignity, respect, happiness, and love were what I wanted to dedicate the rest of my life to, but in the context of ideas, because ideas really move the world. So I came to a little university in Cambridge, Massachusetts that has gained some reputation, some good and some bad, but a real opportunity to, with that platform, to talk to the next generation of leaders. I teach a class, I teach leadership and happiness at Harvard University, at the Harvard Business School. I also teach at the Harvard Kennedy School. And these are people that are going to go on to, many of you are probably Harvard alumni, and congratulations on that. It truly is a great university. I mean, many people complain about Harvard. Many people sort of talk dirt about Harvard, but there's nobody who has ever said, I'm sorry I went to Harvard. And it's actually there's an old joke that there are 3 identities that you can learn about somebody within the first 2 minutes of meeting them: Harvard graduates, vegans, and Marines. I've met some who are all 3, but not very many. But anyway, it's been an extraordinary experience developing these ideas of bringing happiness ideas, the science of happiness, which is my specialty as a social scientist from even before I went to AEI, into the leadership journey. And the main idea that I try to help my students take away is that we are a self-improvement people. It's easy to sort of see self-improvement as some corny or cheesy thing that you learn about on late night television or in the ballroom of a Holiday Inn out by the airport. But you know what? That's the essence of what it means to participate in the experiment of dignity and American greatness. You are the CEO of your life. You are the startup entrepreneur of You Inc. And understanding the principles of happiness, of lifting yourself up and lifting other people up around you, it is the most empowering thing that I can bring. I have a class, the class that I'm teaching right now in the middle of my semester at HBS. It's literally the most oversubscribed class at the Harvard Business School. I have 2 sections of 90 students and I have 400 on the waiting list. Look, who doesn't want to be happy? But the whole point is, if you want to be happier, you need to understand the science, or the ideas at least, apply them to your life, and share them with other people. That's what I'm doing at Harvard. Also in the pages of The Atlantic, which is a terrific ideas magazine. Every Thursday morning, I have 1,500 words on the science of happiness. I'm developing a television show. I'm speaking continually. And today I want to tell you about my new book on the subject. It's interesting. People say, have you really gotten away from policy and politics? And I say, no. Happiness is at the center of American policy and politics. Once you lose the happiness part, you lose everything. You want evidence? Look at the past 10 years of American politics. Not very much happiness. And my guess is a lot of you are not very satisfied with where we are. So let's talk a little bit about this new book, which is really a book for let's say, for people who are over 50 or who want to get there. And here's the basic question. What can any of us do at 25 or 45 or 65 to see whether or not the last few decades of our life can be the happiest decades of our life? Now, the reason I say that is because people in the last decades of their life matter a lot. This is one of the countries around the world where, I mean, we talk about other societies that venerate old people. Older people in America have an enormous amount of political, sociological, and economic clout. And the happier they are, the happier the country is going to be. There's a big interest in making sure that people who are 65 and 75 and 85 are living their best lives. And nobody had ever written a book about it. Nobody ever looked at the science of that, about what my students in their late 20s can do so that 50 years hence, they can be living their best lives. Now, here's a problem. When I started studying this subject, I noticed that people who are in their 70s, they tend to be in one of 2 categories. They have been getting happier since about the age of 65, and they've been getting unhappier since the age of 65. It's weird because before that, the whole population kind of moves in tandem. You find that people through their early adulthood, as they're developing their careers and moving around and having children, their happiness, generally speaking, it's not terrible, but it tends to decline a little bit. And that's not bad news. The meaning in their life is rising, but the enjoyment is a little bit tricky. That's secret code, as Lisa knows, for teenage kids. And then around the age of 55, almost everybody sees their happiness start to increase. And this is based on large databases of 500,000 and more Americans and citizens all around the world. This is the same pattern, by the way, every place in the world. This is not just us. This starts to increase. Almost everybody gets a boost and increase from early 50s until late 60s. It's kind of a renaissance time. not coincidentally, when the kids have moved out. And it's funny, I used to see these data and I'd say, it can't be true. And then my kids became teenagers and I say, it's funny when they're little and they're 8 years old, you say, it's inconceivable that they'll ever go out on their own, that they'll ever move out. And at 14, it becomes kind of an interesting idea. And then at 17, it's necessary. and the truth is that people, they start enjoying their lives, and if your marriage survives your children, your marriage tends to get better, et cetera, and you get this really nice period. But then in mid to late 60s, you find that people break up into two groups in terms of happiness. Half the population gets happier and happier and happier all the way to the end. And the other half starts to go back down again. I asked myself, what is it about those two groups? What do they have in common and how are they different? And at first I thought, I know who's going to be on the bottom rung, who's going to go back down again when they're in happiness. It's going to be people who are really disappointed with their lives, who didn't live up to their own expectations, who have not been successful. And that, my friends, is wrong. There are two social psychologists at the University of Texas at Austin named Carol and Charles Holohan, married couple. And they looked at huge amounts of data over many decades where people were identified as strivers, as smart, as hardworking when they were kids. I'm talking about you. You were good students, you were hard workers. Maybe some of you had a few stumbles, but come on. You're not AEI people. You're not, people who are successful in business and taking care of your lives. If you had not been identified at some point in your life as talented, hardworking, a striver. It turns out that people who are in this category early on, no matter what they do, because generally speaking, they are very successful with their lives, they're the ones who tend to be most frustrated later on. That's weird, right? So digging into it a little bit more, it turns out there's kind of a striver's curse that happens to a lot of people. And that striver's curse is basically this. When you work hard and you have a lot of success, you tend to go up this curve pretty early on in your 20s and 30s. The problem is everything that goes up must come down. And sooner or later, every party ends. And the idea of getting your success and your satisfaction from all the wonderful things that you've been able to achieve in your life and in your work, that's pretty disappointing when it goes away. And it can be a real source of not bitterness necessarily, but of kind of emptiness for a lot of people. And that's one of the reasons that you see people who should be least likely to be frustrated at the end of their lives are most frustrated. There are a lot of cases of this throughout history. And I'll give you one famous case that really had an impact on me. If I were to say, make a list of the 5 most famous scientists in the past 500 years, Charles Darwin would be on that list. I don't care what your list is. It's got Galileo or Marie Curie, or Darwin's on your list. Darwin was a very interesting character. He had incredible success early on. He was selected to be the naturalist, that is to say, the resident scientist on a voyage of a sailing ship called the Beagle when he was 22 years old. Now, at 22, he got on this ship with a bunch of, the sailors and the people who were responsible for the scientific voyage. And it was going to last 5 years. And it, in point of fact, did. He was gathering specimens, zoological and botanical specimens, and sending them back to Europe to be examined by scientists and getting very famous in his absence. And while he was on this 5-year voyage, he started to formulate a theory of natural selection. And when he came back at age 27, my friends, 27, he dropped the equivalent of an atomic bomb intellectually on the scientific community called the theory of evolution. He explained why there seemed to be intermediate species between the old fossils and the stuff we saw walking around today. And it changed the understanding of the natural world permanently. 27 years old, unbelievable. He developed these theories. They were pretty rudimentary when he came back, but he developed these theories in a coherent way until he was in his early 50s and getting more and more famous. He was the king of the mambo for science. Every place he went in Europe, he was feted as the king. He was rich, he was famous, and you look at his letters, he was having a pretty good old time. Well, around age 52, his work stopped. Well, what happened? And the answer is, well, you have to go back a little bit in his history to find out. He had turned out as a kid, he was a terrible, unmotivated student. The problem with Charles Darwin, he was fundamentally lazy. And he didn't study his math. He didn't study his statistics. He didn't study his German. These are things that you needed to study if you wanted to be a self-respecting scientist. At about age 51, 52, he hit a wall in his own research, and he couldn't go through it because he didn't have enough mathematical capability to understand the next step in his work. That next step was actually developed by a Czech priest by the name of Gregor Mendel, who had invented a theory called genetics. Charles Darwin couldn't read the papers. They were in German. He couldn't understand the papers. They were too mathematically analytical. They were too sophisticated for Charles Darwin. And that was it for Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin wrote to a close friend at that time. He says, I have no motivation to do anything that I enjoy, to start a new piece of research, because he couldn't. He kind of derivatively wrote some more books. He wrote actually 11 more books, but he thought they were terrible. And they were kind of copies of his old work. And at age 73, he died considering himself to be a failure. Now, he wasn't a failure. I mean, think, if I had 1/10 of Charles Darwin in me, seems like I would be satisfied for the rest of my life. But you know that's not how it works. You know that what you did a long time ago just isn't enough to maintain your satisfaction. You need success and value. You need to be engaged all the way to the end. And he wasn't. Now, he was buried at Westminster Abbey as the greatest scientific hero of British history. But if you had asked him at the very end, he would have said, yeah, he's not that great. And you see this again and again and again. So let me ask, when I'm looking at people who are strivers, who are doing a lot with their lives, who want to really change the world, what can they do to not wind up like that? How can they be successful early on and get on the upper branch? What can they do? When I say they, you know what? I mean we. I mean me. This is a 8-year research project I'm describing that I had no intention whatsoever of publishing as a book. But when I cracked the code on this, I showed it to my wife, Esther, and she said, you're not going to keep that to yourself, are you? So I sent it to Penguin Publishing, and they said, yeah, this is a book. I don't think they intended the book to end up on the Times Square Jumbotron, but that's the book that comes out next Tuesday, 5 days from now. What I found was that there's one strategy that people who are very successful early on take that's a bad strategy. And there are 3 strategies that are incredibly good for being happy and well in the last quarter of life. So what are they? What's the bad strategy? The bad strategy is the raging against the dying of the light strategy. It's interesting. I was talking to, when I was interviewing this woman for the book, a titan on Wall Street. Somebody who had gotten very famous and very rich very early in financial industries. And now my age, mid to late 50s, she was kind of missing a step. She was finding she wasn't as interested in her work as she used to be. She was still pretty venerated in the industry, but she noticed that, younger colleagues were getting a lot of stuff that she wasn't getting, that she was actually getting a little bit bored. And there was a lot of other things that she didn't like about her life. When she had kind of a distant relationship with her adult children, her relationship with her husband was just kind of okay. She wished she had a stronger religious faith than she actually had or had time to have. She probably drank a little bit too much, she told me. And so I said, it's obvious what you need to do. You need to work less, develop your relationships, get into your house of worship, cut down on your, go to the gym. All these obvious things that, look, I'm a happiness professor. And I said, why don't you do that? She said, well, I think maybe I would prefer to be special than happy. I thought to myself, that is the classic statement of the success addict, isn't it? I would prefer to, because anybody can be happy. Anybody can go on vacation with their kids, but not everybody can be a titan on Wall Street. And even that was starting to fade. And she was in a panic. She was raging and raging. Another person I interviewed for the book said, look, there's going to be no decline for me. I'm going to go and go and go till the wheels come off. Like, that doesn't sound fun. Work, 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 croak. That sounds terrible. That's a bad strategy, because it turns out everybody who does that in trying to be happy on the basis of what worked in the old days winds up unsuccessful in what really matters, which is having meaning and happiness and love and abundance in the final decades of their life. So there are 3 strategies, however, that people who have cracked this code. And I want to tell you, to begin with, of somebody who starts sounding like Darwin and winds up much happier than Darwin. And that's the great composer Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, maybe some of you like music and maybe some of you don't. I love music. I started the first 12 years of my career as a classical musician. I didn't actually finish college till I was 30. And the reason is because as my parents called my 20s my gap decade. I was on the road playing classical music. I was in the Barcelona Symphony. My favorite composer was Johann Sebastian Bach. 1685 to 1750 he lived. Unbelievably productive. He published more than 1,000 pieces of music for all different instrumentations, and at the same time had 20 children. So that guy was productive. And Bach had the same kind of trajectory as Darwin. In his 20s, he got super famous because his work was the most inventive, the most innovative example of the high Baroque that had really ever been written. People loved Bach. People flocked. He was getting commissions from royalty. His name was every place. This was before social media, and he was famous. He would have had a reality show. Bach was, as they say, as my kids say today, the man. But then at age 50, something happened. His productivity and his innovation stopped. And the reason is because a newly famous composer changed the style of music everybody wanted, and Bach couldn't keep up anymore. And that composer who supplanted him was his own son, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, known as CPE Bach, who became the most famous composer in Europe and left his father in the dust. And high Baroque music sounded today like disco does to us. I mean, it was like an anachronism. His son, CPE Bach, was getting all the commissions. And it's interesting because you can imagine somebody being a little resentful under the circumstances. Like, I was the master of the high Baroque and it got left behind by these idiots because of this newfangled classical style from my son. That's craziness. So what did he do? Did he rage against the dying of the light? Did he complain? Did he become bitter? No. Bach retooled himself from the greatest innovator of music to the greatest teacher of music. Now and what did he do? He actually started a school of music in Leipzig in the Thomaskirche, the Thomas Church, and students from all over Europe came to study with him. He was less perhaps prestigious, rich, famous, but he was the most revered teacher of his time. He actually dedicated himself to writing a textbook on the high Baroque that nobody was listening to in concerts anymore. But he thought, someday somebody's going to think this stuff is kind of cool, maybe. Turns out 100 years after he died, it was rediscovered by a composer named Felix Mendelssohn, who said, there is nothing more beautiful than this. And that's what we listen to today. But he didn't know that. He was writing this textbook called The Art of Fugue, which he wrote until the end of his life. He literally died mid-measure writing his textbook for posterity, for love of the art, for the love of his students. And his son, CPE Bach, who had supplanted him, wrote in the margins of that piece, at this point, the composer put down his pen and died. Strong finish. So what did Johann Sebastian Bach do that made him surrounded by love, by his many children and his multitudinous grandchildren, and supported by the faith that had sustained him all throughout his life, by his beloved wife and his students who revered him, dying happy? What was his secret? Well, it turned out that he had really 3 secrets. The first was that he had gotten off his first success curve and he found another one behind it. And that second success curve was actually the teaching curve that everybody has. Now, there's the work of a psychologist that came much later, of course, because psychology is a new profession, named Raymond Cattell. He was a British social psychologist who noticed that early geniuses had what he called fluid intelligence. Now, by the way, that's you. Early on in your 20s, you have innovative capacity. You can solve people's problems. You have cognitive horsepower. You're a hotshot. But that innovative capacity and ability to, with analytic speed, that tends to decline through your late 30s and 40s, and it tends to be pretty low in your 50s. And that's why some people become frustrated. I remember when I was 45 years old that one of my young kids at the time, relatively young kids at the time, was able to beat me at checkers over and over and over again. Like, hey, I'm dad. I'm way smarter. What's going on? His fluid intelligence was increasing. Mine was decreasing. But there's another intelligence curve behind it that most people don't know exist, called the crystallized intelligence curve. That's your wisdom curve. You're not as quick solving old problems. What you are good at is taking facts and knowledge, combining them and describing them to others to sum up what's really going on in the world. In other words, this is what master teachers have. This is what historians have. This is what the Dalai Lama has. This, my friends, if you're my age or older, this is what you have in abundance. And the secret is what Johann Sebastian Bach did inadvertently. He jumped from his fluid intelligence curve to his crystallized intelligence curve. He went from innovator to master teacher. And in so doing, he went from strength to strength. He went from success to success. One of the reasons he died happy is because he died successful. He didn't have to look back on it and say, the good days were the old days. No. He died doing what he was uniquely qualified to do. And what you are uniquely qualified to do, if you know the curve is there, you figure out the way that's unique to your life to express it, and you're courageous enough to make the jump. Now, the second thing that Bach did, that Darwin didn't do, that so many people didn't do, is he stopped adding stuff to his life and started subtracting things from his life. I was actually studying with a historian and philosopher of Eastern art and artifacts. And I asked him one time, what's the difference philosophically between Western and Eastern art? He said, well, when you think of a piece of art in the West that's unstarted, your metaphor is an empty canvas. You start adding brushstrokes, right? It starts from nothing and add brushstrokes. The problem is, after a little while, you can't see if you add more brushstrokes. You can't get more successful by adding more paint. He said, we in the East, we see a successful piece of art starting as a block of uncarved jade. And we chip it away and we chip it away. And inside, the art already existed. Our job is to find the art that was already there. And I said, well, that's interesting. I mean, must have a metaphor for life. He said, yeah. If you want to be a successful person, if you want to do really a lot with your life and be happy, he said, you have to start as a Western artist with an empty canvas and fill it up. But halfway through, you need to go east and see your art as your life as a block of jade and chip away the extraneous parts that aren't you. And real success means finding the you within. In other words, in the second half of your life, you shouldn't be adding. The boat won't do it. You got to take things away until you find the true you. What Bach was doing was throwing away the things that were extraneous to his life. He no longer had a bucket list of professional successes. He had a reverse bucket list of the things that to which he wanted to become detached. And we can do that as well. See, satisfaction, we always think, is a function of what we have. Real satisfaction is what we have divided by what we want. When you decrease the denominator of a fraction, the number goes up. And if we manage our wants instead of our haves, the wants about our lives, about the money and the power and the pleasure and fame, then we can focus on what really matters, which is the faith and the family and the friends and the work that actually serves other people abundantly. Stop adding, start taking away. That's strategy number 2. And now here's the most important strategy for Bach, which is to cultivate his roots. I was doing some of this work at the Aspen Ideas Festival. I was hanging out in Aspen, Colorado. A lot of us wind up going through there, occasionally during the summer. It's beautiful. The aspen trees are unbelievable. And I remember thinking I was sitting under an aspen tree. That aspen tree is an incredible metaphor for the successful person, right? Solitary, strong, admirable. A friend of mine who knows a lot more about botany than I did said, actually, that's a really good metaphor because it's not solitary. It turns out that in Aspen, Colorado, all of the trees are one plant. And I did not know this. See, here's the deal with the aspen tree. It's one extensive root system, and all of the apparently single trees are individual shoots off the same root system. The largest single organism in the history of the world is an aspen stand in Utah called Pando, which is 106 acres of aspen trees, dense aspen forest, one plant, 6 million kilograms. Now, why do I bring that up? Because it turns out that every time we look for a metaphor of strong, solitary, successful people, the loner, the cowboy, it's always a bad metaphor. The loner winds up isolated. The loner winds up lonely. But if you recognize that the better metaphor is that there is a root system connecting us all together that, if properly cultivated, can help us understand that that the individual manifestation of my own life can actually be even more satisfactorily understood by looking at the aspens around me, my friends, my colleagues, the people in my community, my children, my marriage. What Bach did in the second half of his life is he doubled down on love. He got to know his children better than he ever did. I mean, what he really cared about in terms of career was not Johann Sebastian Bach's career. It was the very CPE Bach's career, and Johann Christian Bach and Johann Friedrich Bach and all of the Bachs that went on to become more famous than he was. He took intense pride in his students, which included his children. And he had intense love for his wife, and he had intense love for the divine. After he died, they found his family Bible, which had his handwriting in all of the margins again and again and again. And afterward, his ideas were so profound and his writings using the Bible were so deep that he was often called the fifth evangelist. That was his root system. That was his love. And each of us today can do this as well. To cultivate our root system will give us the most intense satisfaction and joy that we could ever expect. Meantime, cutting out the stuff on the bucket list that we know is empty and that we will never want somebody to put in our eulogy. I mean, what do we want? We want loved his family. We don't want had a lot of frequent flyer miles in our eulogy. At least that's not my thing. And finally, getting on that success curve. What does it mean for you to be a teacher, to be a mentor, to be the sharer of wisdom? Those are the three secrets, my friends. That's the case study that I find again and again and again. I have Bach that I talked about today, but I have many, many more in the book. And if you enjoy it, I hope that it helps you. It certainly helped me. The name of the book is From Strength to Strength, which comes from the 84th Psalm, the 5th verse. And it's an interesting thing because in the Hebrew Bible, from strength to strength is a blessing. It's Michael Chael. And that's really my last word to you today before I get to hear what's on your mind, that I hope that you go to your success curve, that you chip away what's extraneous, that you build your root system, and that in sum that you go from strength to strength. God bless you. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you to all my friends in Chicago.
Thank you, Arthur. We're going to open this up for questions in a few minutes, or actually in about 30 seconds. So if you have a question, raise your hand, put it in the chat, and we'll call on you in the order in which they come. This book is truly so good, and your remarks this morning were awesome. I don't know if you could see some of the nice things in the chat. The part about, taking notes and putting things in the margin, that's what I did. Mm-hmm. And while he gave an overview of it, some of the meat of it is not, there's so much more than in the book than what Arthur could hit on today in our 30 minutes. It's so good.
Thank you, Lisa. One thing I wanted to mention is that this, we're putting together a project to bring these ideas in a charitable way to more leaders and to more ordinary people. And if people want to learning how to get sort of in just the first rungs of the ladder, we're putting together a nonprofit institute for these ideas, for the scientific study of happiness, as a matter of fact. And anybody who wants to get more interested, is interested in being involved in that philanthropically, or for that matter, any other way with ideas or energy or however is useful to you, please talk to me or Lisa about that.
The other piece is, if you buy it and read it, I'm just doing a little promotion on behalf of your publisher. Please put a review on Amazon, tweet about it, tell your friends about it, because I'd love to see this go on the New York Times bestseller list like all your other books have. And I think it'll be your best one. So just a little plug for the publisher. We're going to open it up, and the first question came in via text, and it is, what do you think about bucket lists? You mentioned reverse bucket list. What's your take on bucket lists? Bucket
lists are basically a bad idea, is my view. And I understand why they exist. I mean, they exist to give you a sense of aspiration and goals, but we're talking about strivers here. Strivers do not lack aspiration and goals. Strivers are all about aspiration and goals. Look, I mean, I know who the first hand up on. We're going to talk to Bob Crawford next. Bob Crawford is a phenomenally successful man. Everybody in my classes at HBS wants to be the next Bob Crawford. People like Bob Crawford don't need a bucket list. People like Bob Crawford and all the rest of us, we need to not to focus on our attachments, to focus on our cravings, to focus on the things that we don't have. When you focus on the things that you don't have, you wind up lowering your life satisfaction. The thing is to look into the bucket and say, what's the money, power, pleasure, fame? What's the stuff that is not dignified of my attachments and my cravings, and throw them away. And then to say, what is in there that I really should focus on? The faith, the family, the friendship, the work that can actually lift other people up. And so I talk in the book, and I have an exercise for my Harvard class that I make them do called how to put together a reverse bucket list and how to practice it on your birthday every year. That's what I recommend. Sorry, Bob, I didn't use you as a case study, but I admire you a lot.
All right, Bob, you were the first hand up. So you are, ask away, my friend. And you got to unmute yourself.
Sorry that my wife, who's about 30 feet away, is not here to listen to that. Thank you. She might have a different comment.
Everybody's wife does, Bob. Even Bob's wife.
This fundamental issue that you and I have talked about is what we do with our lives towards what we would call the chronological edge.
Yeah.
Mathematically, we are going to end at some point in time. And I've found that this work that we've been doing for the last 5 years of developing entrepreneurs in the disadvantaged areas of Chicago, started with 1, next year we had 5, 10, now we have 25 in a 9-month program. And I've got the support of Chicago Community Trust. But the key thing is these volunteers, and honest to God, the people that are charged up the most have been retired executives that are looking for something to do.
Right.
And they have been wonderful mentors, and they've developed a soul thing, and the happiness that they've developed is incredible.
Yeah.
Now, yet our sample is still small. We have 25 in this group. These are entrepreneurs of color that have had at least 2 years of business, and we mentor them. And then we provide a $20,000 grant that they can then expand their business. And all 65 that we've supported are still in business today. That is soul strengthening for some of these older executives who are mentors.
Yeah, no, that's great, Bob. Thank you for the work that you're doing. And this is a case study and helping. I mean, look, you're helping the people who are the entrepreneurs, obviously. But the people that you're helping that might not be as a parent are the mentors themselves, because you're giving them an opportunity to get from the first success curve to the second success curve.
Right.
You're giving people a way to get from fluid intelligence to crystallized intelligence. And I see this again and again. They say, it's funny. I went through business and I did really well, and then I wasn't as interested in anymore. And then I taught that class. I mentored those kids, and I found my second wind. Well, that's what it is, basically. You're helping people to do that. You're a second curve guy, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Hey. Who's up? Miles, I think, right? Hey, Miles.
Hi, Arthur. I'll double down on Lisa's comments and thank you. You've had a profound impact on my life also.
Thanks.
Policy making to bipartisan coalition building.
Yeah.
A question I have as it relates to mentoring and being of influence and sharing your value with the younger generation. One of my concerns is that the generation that's coming up, they look at each other as sources of validation for information. Their news sources aren't institutions, it's peer groups, it's social media. I wonder how does that integrate into your belief or how we should approach young people when they might not be looking to us for mentorship and for guidance?
Yeah. So it's interesting. What you're talking about is the enormous impact that tech culture has on social comparison. And social comparison is a huge problem for happiness. One of the things that I teach my students is that the more that they socially compare, the unhappier they will be. There's just no upside in social comparison. Now, I understand why people do that. You want to baseline your own happiness. Or my own success. How do I know I'm doing well? If I'm in a cave on an island, I don't really know if I'm collecting more coconuts than average. On the other hand, if there's a cave next door with another guy, you get the picture. And it's very easy to do social comparison with social media. That's one of the most important habits that people need to learn. And one of the things that I'm actually finding, quite interestingly, is that there are a lot of people. So the millennials, for example, they're tending to be the most lonely generation. They have higher rates of mood disturbance. You find that even suicide rates are greatly elevated, especially for women and girls who are, in their 20s. And a lot of it has to do with social comparison on social media. It just does. I mean, we can't deny that. It's also the fact that dating, love, marriage, cohabitation are all down by about a third for people in their 20s compared to when they were in the 80s. And a lot of that has to do with dating apps. It also has to do with the culture that's basically setting men and women against each other to a very large extent and making them fearful of each other, which is a real problem. I mean, you tell people that everything's bad and then it turns out that's not great for love. And love is the secret to everything, not just romantic love, friendship, family love. Love is the secret to happiness. Younger people, we're finding many are developing better social media habits and turning away from these tools, understanding that the people are basically saying, I want to be happy. And what can't continue forever, AKA misery and unhappiness, won't. What we need to encourage people is not to, hey kids, look to us. We've got good advice. And say, don't do the thing that's making you insane. Don't do the thing that's making you miserable. You need better happiness hygiene, and that means a more responsible use of social media. So as parents, we need to train people in that, but a lot of young people are learning that, and that's one of the key things I teach my students at HBS. If you're looking at social media for more than 30 minutes a day, added up across all platforms, you're going to get unhappier and lonelier, and by the end of the semester, they're all deleting their social media apps, and they're all prospering as a result, and they're all coming to me for advice. So, it's a win-win. Thanks, Miles.
Just out of respect for everybody's time, we officially have 3 minutes left, but we have a number of questions. Arthur, are you good to stay on for a few more minutes?
Of course, I've got until 9, absolutely. I mean, that's 9 your time, 10 for me.
Awesome. Our next question will come from Jack Daly, who may be in California or out east. One never knows. He's the international man of mystery. So Jack, ask your question.
Jack, what's on your mind?
Thanks, Lisa. And Arthur, thanks for sharing perspectives. Really appreciate it. I'm calling in from San Francisco. What role does nutrition and exercise play in happiness in the second half?
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of interesting research on that. And it's one of the things that obviously I talk about with my students. So there's one of the things that I haven't talked about today, but that I teach is that happiness and unhappiness are not opposites. They're actually processed cognitively in different hemispheres of the prefrontal cortex. So happiness is on the right side of the brain, and unhappiness tends to be processed on the left side of the prefrontal cortex. And they tend to turn each other off. So when you're really unhappy, it turns off your happy cognitions and vice versa. Now, that means that different practices are going to affect you in terms of either happiness or unhappiness. So a lot of people make the mistake of they think they want to have more happiness. What they really have is an unhappiness problem. So people will say, man, I got to cut down my commute. I'll be so much happier if I live closer to work. And that's actually not right. You won't get happier with a lower commute. You'll get less unhappy with a lower commute. So one of the things I ask my students to do is to figure out what's my problem, a scarcity of happiness or an excess of unhappiness. You get the picture. Okay, now back to your question. Where does health and wellness enter into the picture? And the answer is it lowers unhappiness. There is some mood enhancing element for happiness per se, but what it does is it lowers negative affect so you can actually get on with the happiness portion of your life. What happens is that unhappiness is obscuring your ability to produce your own happiness, and eating right and getting fit and living well. What that does is it dramatically increases your negative affect. There's a positive cycle. And by that, I don't mean good, positive in a good way. There's a self-reinforcing cycle where when you're unhealthy, it increases your negative affect. That is to say, bad feelings. Bad feelings impair your executive judgment. So for example, when I'm lonely, the first thing I tend to want to do is to cocoon by myself in my house on the couch with a pint of Haagen-Dazs watching Netflix alone. The worst possible thing to do. So you clip that cycle with what we call an opposite signal strategy. It's what we teach the students. The opposite signal strategy says when I want to cocoon and sit on the couch, I go out and I ride my bike. When I want to be by myself and lick my wounds, I get on the phone and call a friend. Those are the opposite signal strategies. And when you want to you feel crummy and you just want to sit around, that's when you go to the gym. That's the opposite signal strategy. That cuts the negative feedback or the positive feedback cycle of negative affect and bad health and negative affect and bad health. And it allows you to start developing the positive affect that you want to see in your life. So that's the right strategy. And it's super important. Now, the one thing, I have a lot of students who are depressed. 50% of Harvard students are being treated for mood disorders. 50%. I want my friends you to absorb that statistic, which is pretty profound in my view. What's the first thing I tell them to do? Number one, I was like, yeah, you can go work out for 90 minutes a day. Nobody's going to do that. I tell them to get up at the crack of dawn without their devices and go for a 60-minute walk. Walking is the first thing to do to cut negative affect. And then we can scale it up from there. Then we can actually talk about nutrition, and then we can actually talk about endurance training and resistance training and all the other ways that are more exotic. But walking is the first step. Thanks for that, Jack. And I'll be out there in California in the first week of April. That's when the book tour starts. I'm hoping that California is even more open than it is today by then. I hope to see you then. I'll let you know when we're out there, okay? Thanks a lot. Good to see you.
All right, our next question comes from Nikki Anderson.
Hi, Nikki.
Hi, Arthur. It's great to see you. I'm always happier listening to you and seeing my friend Lisa. So thank you. You had mentioned earlier the importance of value, right?
Yeah.
Feeling that feeling of value. And so I have to tell you, I just turned 60 this past year and I've never been happier, right? So my question is, when you're younger, I think that value maybe is more externally. That's how you get it, is more from an external means. Do you think that as we get older that we are able to recognize the value, which is maybe why we're able to pivot and reinvent, because we know that value is there? Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and it makes a lot of it. The truth of the matter is that some people can and some people don't, which is exactly what we're talking about. So Darwin couldn't, Bach could. And Bach happened upon it serendipitously. I wrote this book that gives the guide to becoming like Nikki. That's the point of the book, is to be able to do that, but not having to happen across it to my internal source of value. So that what we talk about, there's an interesting part of psychology called learned helplessness, where people find that they can't, anything they do, no matter what their effort is, that it doesn't create value. And as a result of that, they kind of give up. This happens, we have an animal experiments and human experiments. The opposite of that is earned success, where you feel like you're creating value with your life and value in the lives of other people. Earned success has phases. Generally speaking, it is external because it's getting validated by your work. You're getting rewarded for your accomplishments early on. Later on, you have to find the internal source of your earned success. That's exactly what you're talking about. That's moving from the first to the second curve. That requires chipping away. That requires cultivating the root system and the other, 7 big tips, or the 7 big secrets that are in this book, so that we don't have to leave it up to chance. In other words, you're exactly right. We just want everybody to have the technology to be as happy as you.
Thanks. You.
I'm glad you're happy. You look happy. It's great.
All right. Our next question comes from General John Borling.
John Borling.
Well, good to see you again, Arthur. And so pleased you
sir.
started with Bob Crawford at the beginning of this thing, who has wisdom to share with us all. I was on an airplane and I was coming from a speech, and I really liked this speech because I did the 4 things that the Greeks told us you have to do in your life. And then I added a couple of others that were of my own construct. And one of them was that the essence of the human condition is the ability to create. And I was sharing this with my seatmate. And I said, and that's my speech, these 7 things. And she said, you dummy. She said, you've forgotten love, which I've now added. So we now have 8 things. But in the end, this business of happiness, your friend and my great mentor, John Gardner, might argue that happiness minus engagement, and you certainly include engagement, is all important. It's not some kind of ennui, some kind of nirvana laying in a hammock. Right. So that engagement is important. And going back to your Aristotelian notion of happiness, is it not that the unexamined life is not worth living? So you just got to ask a lot of questions. With apologies to George Carlin, but you got to ask a lot of questions.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks very much. Yeah, absolutely. And this one of the key things. Look, there are people who have who are pretty happy, who have relatively unexamined lives, but not very many. And there's a lot of brain science that actually that validates this concept from the Greeks that an unexamined life is not worth living. I mean, this is carved into the side of the Oracle of Delphi. I mean, that's how important that concept was. But now we actually understand neuroscientifically the basis of that claim. The problem that a lot of people have is that they're managed by their feelings. And why is that? Because basic emotions, whether it's anger, disgust, fear, sadness, joy, love, interest, these are the 7 basic emotions, and they originate in what's called the limbic system of the brain. The limbic system is the sort of the lizard brain. It's what processes outside stimuli and translates them into emotions so that we can react without thinking. It's incredible. It's kept us alive. It's a miracle, and it's a wonderful thing. The problem is, if you don't actually examine what you feel about things, your feelings manage you. But there's a simple solution. The examined life is what we call metacognition in modern neuroscience and social science, which is this exactly what the Lord Buddha said when he said, when you have feelings, sit with the feelings and examine the feelings as if they were happening to another person. That's the examined life. You have sadness, you have anger, you have disgust, you have fear, you have love, you have joy, you have interest, you have these automatic feelings, and you say to yourself, that's interesting. I'm sad today. What's this all about? I'm angry right now. I'm fearful right now. And what you're doing literally is moving the emotions from the limbic system of your brain to your prefrontal cortex, to the human conscious part of your brain. All of you listening to me right now, you're using your prefrontal cortex, which is the essence of being able to engage with this material, the big meaty lobes that make us truly modern human beings. I mean, that's what really separates us from my dog Chucho. He's all limbic, no prefrontal cortex. And the result is that his feelings manage him. But if I do this, if I have the examined life, which is to move my emotions through journaling or consciousness or talking, I moved into my prefrontal cortex, and then I manage my feelings. And when I manage my feelings, I manage me. And that's the most satisfying life that we can possibly have. That's the essence of the incredibly insightful point that the great John Borling just made. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final question will come from a gentleman known as Mr. Wagner. Mr. Wagner.
Hello, Arthur. It's
how are you, sir? Good to see you.
Great to see you too. I got to tell you, it is very fun to be married to Lisa and to see your philosophies in action, because she is such an excellent mom. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask you, when you were doing the research for this book, I mean, you're researching happiness, like, how did you find the information about Charles Darwin? How did you find this about Bach? I mean, did you luck into it and then you're like, aha? Or, I mean, I think it's fascinating how you connected all these things.
So it's a great question, Dan. Nice to see you. I appreciate that. Thanks for tuning in today. I could not have written this book in my 30s. And the reason is because in my 30s, with pure fluid intelligence, I was really good at drilling down to the center of the earth on a narrow question. I was literally writing mathematical treatises that today I don't understand. But since then, as my crystallized intelligence is formed, which is the ability to harvest information from many sources, to store them in my library and use them at will, I'm able to write a book like this. And so the truth is that over the last 20 years, I've read a lot about a lot of people, and the ideas come to me about how to use examples better than they ever have before. The advantage of being 57 over being 27 is I can say, I read that book about Bach, and he's a perfect example of this principle. And I read this book about Darwin, and he's a perfect counterexample to the point that I'm trying to make in the book. This book is the fruit of my own crystallized intelligence, which I'm hoping, I mean, the data say that it should continue increasing in my 60s and 70s. And if God lets me keep my marbles into my 90s, I should be able to continue doing this. Now, interestingly, and this really makes the point, there's a guy named Deeth Keen-Simonton, who's a social psychologist at UC Davis, who talks about the creative half-life of idea professions. And he shows that pure fluid intelligence people, they run out of ideas early. So poets who just invent stuff with words, half of their work is done by age 40, and the better half is the first half. Historians who are pure crystallized intelligence, who have to know a lot, have to have a vast library of ideas and put them together to explain things, half of their work is done at 65 and the second half is better. So if you're a historian or anything like a historian, you better take good care of your health because your best books are coming in your 80s, like David McCullough, who's 88. That gives you an idea. Thanks, Dan. That's a great question.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. We've had lots of people request the video, request information on the book. We will be sending out an email to everybody with that information. And just thank you, everyone, for joining. Our next coffee and conversation will be Ellie, 2 weeks from now, with Michael Strain, the head of economics at AEI. And so we hope you can join on that. Special shout out to Austin and Ellie for running tech and the videos and putting all this together. And that's it. Arthur, any closing remarks other than telling everybody to go buy this book because it's really good?
And get the book for someone who needs it. That's all I can say. But Lisa, for creating so much interest and fun and bringing so much love to other people. And that's really the last point that I'll make, which is that every study of the subject that looks at people who are happy at the end of their life knows that happiness at the end, which sums up the what our life is all about. They know that life is denominated not in dollars, not in achievements, not in accomplishments, not in prestige. Life is denominated, the happiness in life is denominated in love. Happiness is love, full stop. Thank you for that, making this possible for me. It's wonderful to see my old friends in Chicago. I can't wait to see you all in person. God bless you all. Thank you, Lisa. I miss you. And I hope to see you all soon.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.